I never thought small towns could be so dark, so full of things people would rather forget. But there's something about small town life that hides the worst secrets, wrapped up in the friendly smiles of neighbors and the quiet, seemingly peaceful streets. It wasn't until I moved to this town that I realized how much those secrets can linger and haunt the place long after everyone else has moved on. I've always been the type to avoid the supernatural. I grew up in a family that prided itself on being rational, grounded, but this town, it's different. It has an air of menace that nobody talks about. The houses, all of them old, creak in ways that make you question the stability of your own mind. And the people, they're friendly, sure, but there's something in their eyes, a kind of hesitation, like they know too much. I moved to this town because of a new job. My last relationship fell apart, and I thought that a fresh start would be the perfect way to put the past behind me. The town looked pretty enough on the surface, rolling hills, old trees lining the streets, that classic American charm. But it didn't take long for me to realize that there was something wrong here. The first sign came when I found the house I wanted to rent. It was on the edge of town, an old Victorian that had clearly seen better days. The landlord, an older woman named Mrs. Harrow, showed me around with a tight-lipped smile, but she seemed eager to get me out the door as soon as possible. I thought nothing of it at the time, assuming she was just a little eccentric. When I moved in, things felt off. The house had this coldness that I couldn't shake, even with the heat cranked up. There were strange sounds at night, creaks and moans like the house was breathing with me. But it was the silence that bothered me the most. The kind of silence that you can feel thick and oppressive, like something was lurking just beyond the edge of your hearing. I tried to dismiss it as my imagination. It had been a stressful few months, after all. But the longer I stayed, the more I noticed the odd things around the house. Flickering lights, doors that wouldn't stay closed, and the strange way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little longer than they should. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps upstairs. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps were too rhythmic, too deliberate. I froze, straining my ears, and the footsteps stopped. Silence again. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I convinced myself that it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. But then I heard the whisper. It was faint, a barely audible murmur coming from the corner of the room. I sat up straight in bed, my pulse racing. "Who's there?" I whispered, but there was no answer. The whisper came again, this time louder, more distinct, almost like it was trying to tell me something. I grabbed my phone and shined the flashlight around the room, but there was nothing. Just the empty space I'd been lying in. It wasn't until the next day that I learned about the history of the house. I was at the local diner, trying to shake off the unease I felt, when I overheard a conversation between two older women. They were talking about the house I'd rented. "It's a shame, really," one of them said. "Such a beautiful place, but no one's ever stayed long. People say it's haunted, but no one wants to talk about it, not in this town." I tried not to listen, but the words stuck in my mind. I had to know more. Later that day, I did some digging at the local library. The house had once belonged to a family, the Darnells. They'd lived there for generations, but their time in the house had ended in tragedy. The father, Thomas Darnell, had been a well-respected man in the community, but he was said to have gone mad after the death of his wife, Mary. The story went that he locked himself in the attic for weeks, refusing to come out, until one day he was found dead, his body twisted and contorted in a way that no one could explain. But the real horror came after that. The town believed that the Darnells' spirits never left the house. There were whispers of strange occurrences, lights flickering, objects moving on their own, and a presence that never seemed to leave. It was said that whoever moved in after the Darnells was doomed to suffer the same fate. I couldn't believe it. I'd heard ghost stories growing up, but this felt different. This felt real. And the more I learned, the more I began to feel like I was being drawn into something I couldn't escape. The next few nights were a blur of restless sleep and waking nightmares. The whispers grew louder, clearer, as if the voices were trying to get my attention. The footsteps became a constant, echoing presence in the house. I could hear them in the halls, pacing back and forth, never stopping. And the shadows, they were everywhere, stretching, crawling, moving in ways they shouldn't. One night, I finally decided to confront whatever was haunting the house. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way upstairs to the attic, where I knew the worst of it had happened. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to the attic was old, heavy, and covered in dust, but it creaked open with a force that sent a chill down my spine. The attic was small, cluttered with old furniture, boxes, and forgotten belongings. But in the corner, there was a chair, a wooden rocking chair, its paint chipped and worn. I didn't want to approach it, but something compelled me. As I got closer, I saw something strange. The chair was moving, slowly rocking back and forth, as if someone was sitting in it. I stepped closer, and that's when I saw it. The figure in the chair. It was faint at first, just a shadow, but it slowly became clearer. A man, sitting with his head lowered, his face hidden in his hands. I couldn't breathe. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, staring at the figure, and then I heard it. The whisper, low and guttural, coming from the figure in the chair. Leave. I wanted to scream, to beg for mercy, but my voice caught in my throat. The figure slowly lifted his head, and I saw his face, twisted, contorted, eyes wide open but empty, like something was staring back at me from the other side of life. And then he stood. I don't remember how I got out of that attic. I don't remember running down the stairs or stumbling out of the house, but I was suddenly outside, gasping for air, my heart racing. I never went back to that house. I left the next morning, never looking back. But the town still haunts me. I can't shake the feeling that something is watching me, that the spirits of the Darnells are still out there, lingering in the shadows of this town, waiting for the next person to make the same mistake I did. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again, but I do know one thing. Small towns are full of things people try to forget, things that never really go away. And sometimes, no matter how far you run, they follow you. Scared yet? Subscribe for more tales from the dark side that'll send shivers down your spine.
Next story.
It all started back in the summer of 2008 when I moved to a small town called Ravenwood. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect to find any kind of excitement. No bustling streets or bright lights. Just old, quiet houses, a few dusty shops, and the faint smell of earth and wood lingering in the air. People kept to themselves, and if you weren't born there, you never quite felt like you belonged. I had inherited an old house from my grandmother. It wasn't anything spectacular, just a two-story colonial house on the edge of town, tucked away behind overgrown trees. The neighbors had told me it was charming and full of history. I didn't know what that meant at the time, but I figured it was just a typical small-town way of describing something old and rundown. I hadn't even been there a week when the strange things began. The first night, I heard knocking on the door. Not just any knock, though. This was slow, deliberate, like someone was testing the strength of the wood. I figured it was probably one of the neighbors coming by to introduce themselves. But when I opened the door, no one was there. The street was completely empty, not a soul in sight. I told myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind or some kids playing a prank. But then, the dream started. Every night I'd wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. There was always the same figure in my dreams. An old woman, her face gaunt and pale, her eyes hollow and black. She would stand at the foot of my bed, staring at me, and then slowly she would reach out, her bony hand inches away from my face. I could never scream. I could never move. And every time, just as her hand touched me, I'd wake up gasping for air. At first, I thought I was just adjusting to the new place, the stress of moving getting to me, but it only got worse. I started hearing voices at night, faint whispers coming from the walls. It wasn't like the house was settling. It was something different, something deliberate. The voices were soft, low, unintelligible, like they were trying to communicate with me, but they were just out of reach, and every time I'd try to focus, they'd stop, as if they knew I was listening. I talked to some of the locals, trying to get a sense of what was going on, but when I mentioned the strange occurrences in my house, they'd go quiet, their eyes widening. They'd give me these nervous smiles, as if they knew exactly what I was talking about, but didn't want to say anything. Some even started to avoid me altogether. There was one woman, Mrs. Holloway, who was the only one brave enough to talk to me about it. She was an elderly woman who had lived in Ravenwood her entire life. I found her in the town diner one morning, sitting alone at a corner booth, staring into her cup of coffee. I asked her if she knew anything about my house. She looked up, her eyes dark, tired. "That house, it has a history," she said slowly, her voice low. "It's been passed down through generations, always to someone new, always someone who doesn't know what they're getting into. Your grandmother wasn't the first to live there, and she won't be the last. It's cursed, you know." I shook my head, not wanting to believe her. "Cursed? What are you talking about?" Mrs. Holloway's fingers trembled as she reached for her coffee cup. "There was a family that lived there before you, a long time ago, the Wilkins family. They were, well, they were not the best people. There was a tragedy, you see, a fire, the kind of fire that leaves something behind, something that never quite goes away." My stomach dropped. "What happened to them?" She hesitated for a moment, glancing around the diner as if making sure no one was listening. "The fire took the mother and the father, but the daughter was never found. They say she still wanders that house searching for her parents, but she's not the same as she was. She's something else now, something darker." I felt a chill creep up my spine, and my mind began to race with questions. What happened to the daughter? Was she the one who was haunting me? Was she the one in my dreams? Mrs. Holloway leaned forward, her voice barely a whisper. "The house feeds on fear. It doesn't just haunt you. It makes you question everything you know. The daughter, she wants to take someone with her. She wants you to join her in the darkness. And if you're not careful, she'll get what she wants." I didn't want to believe her, but that night I found myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my reflection. I had been hearing the whispers again, louder now, as if they were coming from behind the walls. I thought I saw a shadow move in the corner of my eye, and when I turned, nothing was there. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The following days were even worse. The knocks on the door increased, always when I was alone. But when I'd open it, there was never anyone there. I started locking the doors and windows at night, but that didn't help. The shadows would move in the corners of my vision, just out of reach. And always, that woman's face, pale, hollow, and lifeless, haunted me, getting closer and closer with each passing night. I didn't know who to turn to. The townspeople were all afraid, too, whispering about the house but never daring to help. Mrs. Holloway had warned me not to fight it, not to provoke the spirit. But how could I not? How could I just let it take over my life? One night, I decided I had enough. I needed answers, and I was going to get them, no matter the cost. I stayed up late, combing through old papers and photographs that had been left behind by my grandmother. That's when I found it, a newspaper article from the 1920s. The headline read, "Wilkins Family Lost in Tragic Fire." Beneath it, a photograph of the family, the mother, father, and a young girl. Her eyes were dark, almost black in the picture, and her smile seemed twisted, as if she knew something the rest of them didn't. The article didn't say much more than that. No mention of the daughter's fate. But I didn't need more to understand what had happened. That girl, the one in my dreams, she had never left. She was still trapped in that house, and now she was coming for me. I couldn't sleep that night. The whispering was louder than ever, and I could feel her presence in the room. The air grew cold, and I could hear her faintly, just a whisper, just a breath away. "Join me," she breathed. "Join me in the dark." The door to my bedroom creaked open. I turned, and there she was, the woman from my dreams, standing at the foot of my bed. Her face was even more twisted now, her eyes black holes that seemed to suck in all the light around her. Her fingers reached toward me, and I felt my body freeze. The terror gripped me, and I knew she was here to take me. She was going to pull me into the darkness, just as she had with so many others before me. And then, just as her cold hand touched my arm, everything went dark. When I woke up, I was in the living room, lying on the couch. The house was quiet, too quiet. The air felt still, unnaturally still, and for a moment I wondered if it had all been a dream. But then I heard it again, those whispers, faint, but there. And this time, they were coming from the walls. I ran out of the house the next morning, never looking back. I couldn't stay there any longer. I couldn't fight the darkness that had consumed it, consumed me. I moved away from Ravenwood, far away, hoping to leave it all behind. But even now, years later, I still hear those whispers at night. And sometimes when I close my eyes, I see her face again. The girl in the fire, the one who never left. And I know she's still out there waiting, watching, waiting for someone else to join her in the dark. Don't miss out on more hauntingly good stories. Subscribe now.
Next story.
It started like any other move to a new town. I had just graduated college, and after months of searching for a fresh start, I found a place in a small town called Elm Hollow. Quiet, peaceful, almost idyllic in the way that some small towns can seem. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the homes were well kept, their gardens blooming with flowers. I thought it would be the perfect place to escape the chaos of the city. The house I rented was charming enough, an old Victorian with creaky floors and faded wallpaper. It was a bit run down, but I didn't mind. I liked the character of old homes. Their imperfections felt cozy to me. The landlord, a thin man with graying hair named Mr. Whitley, had warned me about the house's history, but I thought nothing of it. He mentioned something about it being special, though the way he said it made me uncomfortable. It was just an old house. Nothing to worry about. On my first night, I unpacked in silence. The town was so quiet that I couldn't help but notice how eerie the silence felt. There were no cars passing by, no voices in the street, just the chirping of crickets outside and the occasional hoot of an owl. I felt isolated, but I brushed it off. After all, it was a small town. The first few nights were peaceful enough, though I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I'd hear faint creaks in the floorboards, the kind that could be easily attributed to the house settling. But there were moments when the sounds didn't make sense, like footsteps echoing from upstairs when I knew no one was there. I didn't let it bother me too much. Small town, old house, probably just the wind. But then things started happening that I couldn't explain. I woke up one night to the sound of faint whispers, like people were talking just outside my bedroom door. At first, I assumed it was a dream, but when I opened my eyes, I could still hear it. Quiet voices, too quiet to make out, but definitely there. I mustered up the courage to get up and check, but when I opened the door, the hallway was empty. Not a soul in sight. The whispers stopped immediately. The next day, I asked Mr. Whitley about the noises, but he just smiled and nodded, as if he already knew what I was talking about. "Ah, it's just the house," he said. "It's seen a lot of life over the years. The walls are full of memories." His tone was odd, almost dismissive. But again, I figured it was just his way of talking. Everyone in this town was a little strange, right? I tried to ignore the feeling of unease that settled over me. But that night, the whispers came again. And this time, they weren't faint. They were clear. Angry, even. It was like a conversation I wasn't meant to hear. The voices were sharp, harsh, and sounded like they were coming from directly beneath me. I walked to the basement door, which I'd avoided so far, not because I was afraid, but because the door was old and heavy, and I didn't feel like going down there. The voices grew louder as I stood in front of it, and I knew deep down that I couldn't ignore it any longer. I turned the handle and slowly descended the stairs. The air grew colder the further I went, and the creaking of the stairs beneath me echoed through the narrow, dark space. At the bottom, there was a dim light bulb hanging from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the walls. The whispers were louder now, almost unbearable. I stood there for a moment, frozen, unsure of what to do next. And then, I saw it. A large wooden trunk sitting against the far wall. It was covered in dust, old and weathered. Something about it seemed wrong. I felt a tug at the back of my mind, like a warning, but I couldn't stop myself. My hand moved toward it, almost of its own accord. The trunk creaked open as I lifted the lid, and a cold draft blew out from inside. I almost gasped, but my voice caught in my throat. Inside the trunk were old photographs, letters, and a small wooden box. I picked up the box, running my fingers over the carvings on its surface. They were intricate but faded, as though they had been worn down by time. I opened it. Inside was a single key. It was small, old-fashioned, and covered in rust. A chill ran down my spine as I held it in my hand. I had no idea what it was for, but I knew that whatever it unlocked was important. Important enough to stir something deep inside the house, something that had been waiting for a long time. I closed the trunk and hurried upstairs, locking the basement door behind me. I wasn't sure why, but I felt like I was being hunted, like whatever was in the house wanted me to find that key. The next few days were the worst. The house grew colder, and the whispers turned to voices, clear, angry, and demanding. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I was constantly on edge, looking over my shoulder, hearing footsteps when I knew I was alone. The key felt heavier and heavier in my pocket, as if it was calling to me, urging me to find the lock it opened. I went to the local library, hoping to find some answers. The librarian, an old woman named Mrs. Larkin, didn't seem surprised when I mentioned the house. "Oh, the Carter house," she said, nodding gravely. "It's been abandoned for years. But before that, well, the Carters weren't like other people. They kept to themselves and they didn't like strangers. They say that one of them went mad. Some people think they were involved in something unnatural." I pressed her for more, but she grew quiet, staring at the floor. "You're best off leaving that house alone," she muttered. "Whatever it is, it doesn't want anyone there." That night, I could no longer resist. I went back to the basement, determined to face whatever was in the house. The key weighed heavy in my hand as I descended into the darkness. I walked toward the far corner of the basement where the trunk had been. There, hidden behind a stack of old furniture, was a small door. It was barely noticeable, tucked away in the corner, as though someone didn't want it to be found. I fit the key into the lock. The door creaked open, and I stepped into a room that didn't feel like it belonged in the house. It was cold, unnaturally so, and the air smelled stale, like something had been sealed away for a long time. The walls were covered in strange symbols, drawn in what appeared to be blood. In the center of the room was a stone altar, its surface worn down with age. But what caught my attention was the figure standing in the corner, pale, gaunt, and watching me with hollow eyes. It was a woman. Her features were twisted, as if contorted by pain or rage, and she was dressed in old, tattered clothes. She was holding something in her hand, something small and delicate, almost like a child's toy. And then she spoke. "Leave," she whispered, her voice like a low, rasping breath. "Leave this place, or you'll become like me." I didn't wait to hear more. I ran. I bolted from that room, out of the basement, and slammed the door behind me. I never went back to that house. I packed my things and left Elm Hollow the very next day. To this day, I have no idea what happened in that house or who the woman was. But I know one thing for sure. Some places aren't meant to be explored, and some things, once found, should never be uncovered. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to subscribe and be a part of our haunting journey.
Next story.
I moved to the small town of Fairhaven in the winter of 2013, hoping for a fresh start. It was a place that seemed to exist in a world forgotten by time, nestled in the shadow of a mountain range with just a few hundred residents and little more than a single gas station and a diner. I had been burned out after years in a high-stress city job and thought a quiet, peaceful life would be the perfect remedy. The house I found was old, but affordable. Cheap, really, and came with a small yard, tucked at the edge of town near a dense forest. From the moment I arrived, I noticed something off about Fairhaven. It wasn't the people. The townsfolk were friendly enough, if a little closed off. But there was a heaviness in the air, an unspoken tension that seemed to linger around every corner, in every conversation. No one ever talked about the past, about what happened to the families that had lived in the area for generations. The town had its own rhythm, its own way of life, and newcomers weren't often welcomed with open arms. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. Small towns have a way of feeling strange to outsiders, especially when you've spent most of your life in the city. But as the weeks went by, I began to notice patterns, things that were too deliberate to ignore. I would hear odd sounds in the night, scratching noises coming from the walls, whispers that seemed to emanate from the floorboards. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but when the noises continued night after night, it started to feel like something else entirely. One evening, I decided to visit the local library to get a better sense of the town's history. It was a small, unassuming place with dusty shelves and the musty smell of old books. The librarian, an older woman named Mrs. Donovan, had the same peculiar, closed-off manner that everyone in town seemed to have. When I asked her about the history of Fairhaven, her expression shifted just for a moment, like I'd touched on something she didn't want to discuss. "The town's past is complicated," she said, her voice low. "There are things that are better left forgotten. Some of the older families still remember, but they don't speak of it. It's better for everyone that way. I pressed her for more, but she wouldn't say another word on the matter. Just be careful, dear, she said before changing the subject, and the conversation ended as abruptly as it had begun. That night, I lay in bed, listening to the sounds of the house, trying to ignore the unease creeping into my mind. The whispers were louder now, echoing in the corners of my room, as though something was trying to get my attention. I tried to sleep, but the restlessness gnawed at me. I finally gave in and got up, deciding to investigate. As I moved quietly through the house, I followed the faint scratching sounds that seemed to be coming from beneath the floorboards. The sound was rhythmic, almost methodical. It wasn't the wind or pipes. It felt intentional. I couldn't pinpoint its source, but I knew it was coming from somewhere near the back of the house. I found myself standing at the foot of the stairs leading to the attic, which I had avoided since moving in. There was something unsettling about the narrow staircase, and the door to the attic was old, thick with dust, and bolted shut. But the noises, they seemed to be coming from above. I hesitated. The air around me grew colder, and the faintest scent of mildew filled the room. Something told me I shouldn't open that door, that I should leave well enough alone. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper force, pushed me forward. I grabbed the rusty key I had found when I moved in and unlocked the attic door. As I opened it, the air seemed to shift. The whispers grew louder, as though they were now rushing toward me. I stepped into the attic, heart pounding, and flicked on the light. The space was cramped, filled with boxes, old furniture, and forgotten things. But in the corner, partially hidden behind a stack of old crates, was a large wooden chest. The chest was old, covered in dust and cobwebs, and had a strange symbol carved into its surface, an intricate, twisted pattern that looked almost like a sigil. The whispers stopped, replaced by a deep silence that made my skin crawl. I couldn't look away from the chest. It was as if it was calling to me, beckoning me to open it. Against every instinct in my body, I approached it. My hands trembled as I ran my fingers over the symbol. The lid creaked as I lifted it, and what I saw inside made my stomach lurch. The chest was filled with old photographs, some of which were too faded to make out, but there were others, disturbing, haunting images of the town from decades ago. Families standing in front of homes, smiling with a sense of pride. But the eyes in the pictures, they were wrong. Their eyes were hollow, lifeless, and they seemed to stare right through the camera. In the back of the chest, buried beneath the photographs, was a small wooden box. It was ornate, carefully crafted, and stained with age. The same twisted symbol from the chest was carved into it, but this box was different. It felt heavier, somehow more important. I picked it up and slowly opened it. Inside, nestled in a velvet lining, was a single item, a tarnished silver key, unlike anything I had ever seen before. It was old but well kept, and felt oddly warm in my hand, as if it had been waiting for me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I didn't know what it was for, but I knew it was connected to the town, to something buried deep within Fairhaven's past. I stood frozen in the attic, the weight of the key in my palm pulling me into an unknown darkness. I had to find out what it opened. I couldn't stop myself. The next day, I went back to Mrs. Donovan at the library. I showed her the key, and for the first time, her stoic demeanor cracked. Her face turned pale, and she quickly motioned for me to follow her into the back room. The door shut behind us, and she leaned in close. "That key," she whispered, "is the key to the old church." I frowned. The old church was a decrepit building on the outskirts of town, abandoned for as long as I could remember. "The church?" I asked. "What does it have to do with all of this?" Her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. The church was the center of the town's practices. It's where they gathered, where they did things. The town was never as peaceful as it seemed. The people of Fairhaven made deals with something ancient, something evil, and when the church closed, the town buried its secrets, locking them away. I left the library with more questions than answers. The whispers, the key, the photographs, it was all connected, tied to the dark history of Fairhaven. That night, I went to the old church, the key heavy in my pocket. When I arrived, the church was even more foreboding than I had imagined. It loomed over the town, its windows dark, the stonework crumbling from years of neglect. The key fit perfectly into the lock on the back door. I turned it, and the door creaked open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and decay. The pews were broken, the altar covered in cobwebs. But at the far end of the church, there was a door, smaller, hidden behind a fallen beam. The key worked again. What I found behind that door was nothing like what I expected. The room was filled with ancient symbols, etched into the stone floor and walls, some of them still glowing faintly in the darkness. At the center was a stone slab, and on that slab lay a figure that was neither fully human nor fully something else. It was a shadow, a presence, a thing that shouldn't have been. And it was awake. I couldn't scream. I couldn't move. The thing in the church rose, its eyes burning with an unholy fire, and it spoke in a voice that echoed in my mind. "Welcome," it whispered. "You've opened the door. Now there's no turning back." Are you hooked on these spine-tingling stories? Subscribe to get more and never miss a scary moment.
Next story.
I never thought a simple job interview would lead me to something I couldn't explain, something that still haunts me every night. But it did. And no matter how hard I try to push it out of my mind, it keeps coming back, like a shadow that follows me wherever I go. I had just moved to this small town after accepting a position at a local marketing firm. The town seemed normal, peaceful even. The streets were quiet, with a few mom-and-pop shops scattered around. Nothing out of the ordinary, just the kind of place I thought I needed to start fresh. The interview was with Mr. Green, the owner of the marketing firm. I had heard a lot about him from the people in town. Everyone said he was a nice guy, a bit reserved, but someone you could trust. So, when he called me in for an interview, I didn't think twice. It was a chance to get settled, and I was eager to start my new life. When I arrived at the office, I was struck by how old the building looked. It was a 2-story brick structure, wedged between a florist and a tiny cafe. The sign outside was faded, almost as if the business had been around for much longer than the town itself. The door creaked as I entered, and the smell of old paper and ink filled the air. Inside, the office was a maze of cubicles, each one filled with dusty paperwork and outdated computers. Mr. Green's office was at the far end of the building. When I knocked and entered, I was greeted by a man in his mid-50s with sharp, calculating eyes. He stood up from behind his desk and extended a hand. "You must be the new hire," he said with a tight smile. Come in, let's get started." I sat down and we dove right into the interview. He asked the usual questions about my experience, my skills, and my goals. But there was something strange about the way he looked at me, like he was measuring every word I said. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air in the room felt thick, heavy, almost as if it had been there for years without being disturbed. After a while, Mr. Green seemed satisfied. "Well, you seem perfect for the job. I think we can make this work. But I must warn you," he added, his voice lowering, "this isn't like any other marketing job you've had. We work on some unique projects. Some people find it a little unsettling." I smiled, thinking he was just trying to make the job sound more exciting. "I'm up for anything," I said. He leaned back in his chair, his eyes darkening for a moment. "Good. We start tomorrow then." The next day, I arrived early, eager to get started. But as I walked through the office, I noticed something was different. The cubicles that had been empty the day before were now filled with people. Workers, their faces drawn, tired eyes staring blankly at their screens. They didn't speak to each other. They didn't even look up when I passed. It was as if they were all part of some strange, silent machine. Mr. Green wasn't in his office, so I sat down at the desk that had been assigned to me. It was cramped, with papers piled high and an old computer that barely turned on. The screen flickered as it booted up, and when it finally came to life, a strange message appeared. "Are you ready for your task?" The screen asked in bold, black letters. I froze, staring at the words. I had expected a simple login screen or a welcome message, not something so ominous. I tried to close it, but the message wouldn't go away. Instead, new instructions appeared on the screen. Task: analyze the clients, find their secrets. I shook my head, thinking I had somehow triggered a glitch. But before I could even process it, a file appeared on the screen. An old, grainy image of a man in his 40s, standing in front of a large building. His name was listed at the top: Carter Davis, CEO, Davis Enterprises. I clicked on the file, and what I saw made my stomach churn. There were no details about the man's career or achievements. Instead, there were pages upon pages of strange, unsettling information. His childhood, his family, his relationships. But the deeper I looked, the more I realized that these weren't ordinary files. These were details about his fears, his darkest secrets, the things that kept him up at night. There were even photographs of places I didn't recognize, strange symbols drawn on the walls, and faces of people I'd never met. Before I could close the file, the screen blinked and another name appeared. Next task, Sarah Jacobs, writer, local newspaper. I tried to protest. What is this? I muttered aloud, but no one answered. The people in the cubicles remained silent, their eyes glued to their screens. I clicked on the new file. Sarah Jacobs. She was the reporter who had written a story about a local disappearance years ago, something that was never solved. The file on her was eerily similar to the first one, detailing her private life, her dreams, her fears. But what stood out to me was a photograph of Sarah, standing by the same building as the man from earlier. Her face contorted in terror, her eyes wide and fearful. I couldn't stop scrolling through the documents. It was like I was under some sort of spell, drawn to uncover the secrets of these people. Each file that appeared on the screen felt more sinister than the last. There were stories of strange occurrences, of people who had vanished from town without a trace, of things that happened in the dead of night that no one dared to talk about. I wanted to scream, to stand up and leave, but I couldn't. It was like my body was trapped in place, forcing me to keep going, to keep uncovering. And then, as I opened the final file of the day, I saw it, my own name. I didn't understand how it could be there. But the more I read, the more the words seemed to burn into my mind. The file described my life in unsettling detail, just like all the others. It knew everything, every move I had made since I had arrived in town. But there was something worse. It talked about things I hadn't told anyone, things I hadn't even realized I knew. The last line of the file read, "You will be the next one." That's when I heard Mr. Green's voice behind me. "You've done well today," he said. "But tomorrow, it will be your turn to be analyzed." I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest. His smile was cold, calculating. "You see, Ellie," he continued, "we're not just marketing for our clients. We're collecting their souls, their fears, their deepest secrets. We keep track of everything. And now it's your turn. There's no turning back." I ran out of the office that day, and I haven't been back since. I don't know what Mr. Green and his business are really about, but I'm certain of one thing. Whatever they're doing, it's not just about marketing. It's something far darker, something that goes beyond business and beyond life. Now, I'm always looking over my shoulder. I feel their eyes on me wherever I go. They know my secrets, and they're waiting for me to fall. I don't know if I can ever escape this place, this town, or the terrifying work I did for them. Don't let these tales of terror end here. Subscribe for more and join our haunted family.
Next story.
It was a quiet town, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie. A place where everyone knew everyone else, where everyone seemed safe, and there was a sense of peace that wrapped the streets in a thick blanket. But under the surface, there were things people didn't talk about, things people didn't want to remember. I didn't know that when I moved here. I was just looking for a new start, somewhere away from the noise of city life. The old house I rented seemed perfect, an old cottage at the edge of town, just far enough from the center to feel secluded but not isolated. The rent was cheap, and the landlord, a man named Mr. Calloway, was a quiet fellow who had been living in the town for decades. He seemed trustworthy, though a bit peculiar. He told me that the house had been standing for over a century. It had once belonged to the Sinclair family, old-time residents who'd made their fortune in the lumber business. But the Sinclairs had vanished from town history. I asked Mr. Calloway about them once out of curiosity, but he just muttered something about them moving on, and that was the end of the conversation. My first week was uneventful. The house had its quirks, creaky floors, crooked windows, and a fireplace that seemed to smoke more than it should. But it was charming in its own way, and I convinced myself that it was exactly what I needed. It was peaceful, and I thought the quiet would help me heal after everything that had happened in my life. But then, strange things started happening. It was small at first, little things I could dismiss as my imagination. A door that would be open when I was sure I'd closed it. The smell of something old, like rotting wood, lingering in the hallways. At night, the floorboards would creak in the distance, like someone was walking around the house when I was alone. But I told myself it was just the house settling. Old houses did that, didn't they? But it wasn't just the house, it was the town too. The people here, they acted like they were hiding something, like there was an unspoken rule about what you could and couldn't ask. One evening, I went to the diner in town to grab a bite to eat. It was a small, dimly lit place with an old jukebox in the corner and a few tables scattered across the room. Most of the patrons were older folks, the kind who had lived their whole lives in this little town. I didn't know anyone yet, so I sat at the counter, ordered a coffee, and tried to make small talk with the waitress. She was friendly, but her eyes, they kept darting toward the door every time someone came in. It was as if she was afraid to make eye contact for too long. After a few minutes, an older man sitting nearby started talking to me. His voice was low and rough, like he'd been talking to himself for years. "You live in the Sinclair house, don't you?" he asked. I nodded, surprised he knew. "Yeah, I do. How did you know?" He didn't answer at first. He just stared into his coffee cup, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge. "I wouldn't stay there long if I were you," he said finally. His voice was steady, but there was a nervous energy to it, like he was afraid to say too much. "Bad things happened in that house. Things you don't want to know about." I laughed it off, thinking he was just an old man telling ghost stories to pass the time. "What kind of things?" I asked, half amused, half curious. The man lowered his voice. "The Sinclairs. They were into things. Things that weren't right. There's a reason why they all left. A reason they never came back." I was starting to feel uncomfortable, but I tried to brush it off. Well, I'm not afraid of a little history. The house is old, but it's just a house. The man's eyes locked on mine, his expression turning serious. "It's not just the house. It's the land. People have disappeared, people who lived there before you. And the town, we don't talk about it because it's easier that way. But if you're smart, you'll leave before it gets worse." I didn't know what to say. I paid my bill and left, shaking off the man's warning as just another crazy story. But when I got home, I couldn't help but think about what he had said. I dismissed it, but the words echoed in my mind as I went to bed that night. And that's when things started to change. The first night it happened, I woke up to the sound of whispering. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but as I listened, the whispers grew clearer. They were coming from upstairs, from the rooms I hadn't even entered yet. I stood up, heart pounding, and walked toward the stairs. The whispers stopped as I reached the landing, but I could still feel the coldness in the air, like the temperature had dropped several degrees. I didn't want to go up there, but something was pulling me. I grabbed a flashlight and made my way to the second floor where the voices seemed to be coming from. The hallway was long, the walls covered in old wallpaper that had started to peel. The air smelled musty, like something long forgotten. I reached the first door on the left and hesitated. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of darkened room beyond. I pushed it open, and as I did, the whispering started again, this time louder, clearer. It sounded like a conversation, but the words were incomprehensible. I stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a large, dusty mirror that hung on the far wall. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I moved toward it. The air felt thick, heavy, as if something was pressing down on me. I turned the flashlight toward the mirror and froze. The reflection wasn't mine. It was a man, tall, thin, with hollow eyes and a face that seemed to change every time I looked at it. He was standing in the reflection just behind me, staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. But when I turned around, there was no one there. I bolted from the room, my heart racing in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't safe in that house anymore. The next morning, I went to see Mr. Calloway, hoping he could explain. But when I knocked on his door, it was his wife who answered. She looked at me with wide, fearful eyes. "Mr. Calloway isn't home right now," she said, but there was something off about the way she said it. It didn't feel like a casual statement. "I just wanted to ask him about the house," I said, my voice shaky. "Something strange is going on there. The whispers, the reflection. I don't know what to make of it." The woman's face went pale. "You shouldn't have moved into that house," she whispered. "It's not just the Sinclairs. It's something older, something far darker. You need to leave before it comes for you too." I left the house without another word. I packed my things that afternoon and never looked back. I don't know what happened to the house after I left or if anyone else moved in. But I still think about it, about the whispers, the reflection, and the dark history of the land. The town has always been quiet, but sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still hear the whispers, just faintly in the back of my mind, urging me to remember the truth that nobody wants to speak. Enjoyed this story? Make sure to subscribe for your next terrifying tale.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts. I thought they were just stories, old legends passed down through generations, meant to scare kids at Halloween. But that all changed when I moved to a small town in the middle of nowhere. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, where nothing ever happened, and where people went to disappear. At least, that's what I thought. I remember the first day I arrived. The sun was setting, casting long shadows over the fields. There was something eerie about the stillness, but I dismissed it as just the quiet of a small town. The house I rented was old, but cheap, which was perfect for me since I was on a tight budget. It had the kind of charm you only see in movies, with creaky floorboards and an old, rocking chair on the porch that seemed to move on its own, but I was used to old places. I didn't mind the quirks, at least, not at first. It started with small things, things I could easily explain away. A picture frame that was slightly off-center, or a door that would creak open when I knew I had shut it. I assumed it was just the house settling. I'd heard stories about old houses making noises, so I didn't think much of it. But then, the dreams started. At first, they were just dreams of the house. I'd see myself walking through rooms I didn't remember, corridors that didn't exist, and doors that led to nowhere. It was like the house itself was trying to tell me something. I woke up every morning feeling unsettled, but I told myself it was just stress. I was in a new town, starting a new life. Of course, I was stressed. But as the days passed, the dreams grew darker. I started seeing people in my dreams, people I didn't recognize. They'd stand at the edge of my bed, watching me with hollow eyes. Their faces were pale, their lips moving as if they were speaking, but no sound ever came. The worst part was how real it all felt. I could feel the coldness of their presence, the weight of their stare, even after I woke up. Then one night, I woke up to a sound. Scratching, like something was dragging across the floor. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, closer. My heart raced as I sat up in bed, trying to make sense of it. I looked around the room, but all I could see was the moonlight streaming through the window. The room was empty, but the scratching continued. I got up, cautiously making my way to the hallway, following the sound. It led me to the basement door. I had never gone down into the basement. I had no reason to. The landlord had warned me that it was old and that I should be careful, but that was all. The door was cracked open, just a little, enough to let the cold air slip through. And that sound, the scratching, was coming from below. My curiosity got the best of me. I couldn't help myself. I grabbed a flashlight and descended the stairs. The air down there was thick, heavy with dust and something else I couldn't quite place. The scratching stopped the moment I reached the bottom, and for a few moments all I could hear was my own breathing. There was nothing. The basement was empty, just old boxes and furniture covered in sheets. I walked around, shining the flashlight over the items. The beams of light danced over the forgotten objects, casting strange shadows on the walls. Nothing out of the ordinary, but something felt wrong. That's when I saw it. At the far end of the basement, against the wall, there was a door. It was small, barely noticeable, and it was unlike anything I had seen before. It was made of heavy wood with iron hinges and a rusted doorknob. There was no reason for a door to be there. It didn't lead anywhere, but there it was. I approached it cautiously, my heartbeat thumping in my chest. As I reached for the doorknob, a cold breeze rushed through the room, and I heard a faint whisper, so faint I could barely make it out. It was a voice, but it wasn't in English. It sounded like pleading. My hand froze on the doorknob. I don't know what came over me, but I turned the handle and opened the door. The room beyond was small and dark, the air thick with mildew. But what caught my eye was the old rocking chair sitting in the corner. It was the same rocking chair I had seen on the porch earlier, the one that seemed to move on its own. But here, in this tiny room, it was sitting still, staring at me, as though waiting for something. I stepped inside. That was when the door slammed shut behind me. Panic surged through me as I tried to push it open, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment, I was plunged into darkness. Then the light came back on, but the room was no longer empty. The shadows had taken shape. Figures stood in the corners, their eyes glowing with an unnatural light, their mouths twisted in silent screams. I couldn't move. I was frozen in place, my body screaming to escape, but my legs wouldn't obey. The rocking chair slowly began to creak, rocking back and forth as if someone invisible was sitting in it. The air grew colder, and the whispers grew louder, louder until it felt like they were inside my head. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I was suffocating in this room, surrounded by ghosts, trapped in a nightmare that felt all too real. The faces around me grew clearer, twisted in anguish, their eyes pleading, begging for help. But I couldn't help them. I was just another victim, just another soul trapped in this small town. In this house that had a history I couldn't even begin to understand. The door suddenly flew open and I stumbled out of the room, gasping for air. I ran up the stairs, out of the basement, and didn't stop until I was back in my bedroom, slamming the door behind me. I couldn't explain what had just happened. I didn't know if it was a dream or something more. But I knew one thing for sure. There was something in that house. Something that didn't want me there. I left the town the next morning, unable to shake the feeling that something was following me. Every time I close my eyes, I hear the scratching, the whispers, the rocking chair. I don't know if anyone else has experienced what I did. I don't know if anyone ever will. But if you ever find yourself in a small town and you're looking for a place to stay, I would suggest you keep driving. Because some places, they never let you leave. Feeling spooked? Subscribe for more terrifying tales that will send chills down your spine.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts or anything supernatural. Growing up, my parents made sure we stayed grounded. No time for silly stories or old town rumors. When I moved to that small town for my new job, I thought it was just another stop in the journey of life, another town to check off the list. But I was wrong. I was so wrong. The first time I noticed something was off was when I walked into the small family-owned antique shop down the street. It was the kind of place you could easily pass by without a second thought, except for the sign that read, "Curiosities and Oddities." I've always had a weakness for quirky places, so I decided to step inside. The bell above the door jingled as I entered. The scent of aged wood and dust filled the air, and the dim light made everything seem more ancient than it actually was. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old trinkets, worn books, porcelain dolls, tarnished silverware. It was a little too much for me, honestly, but there was something magnetic about the place. I didn't know why, but I had to explore. An elderly woman with wild white hair and sharp, knowing eyes appeared from behind a shelf. She smiled at me in a way that made me feel like she had seen me before. "You're new in town, aren't you?" she asked, her voice raspy but kind. "Yeah, just moved here. My name's Ellie." "I know," she said with a knowing smile. "People like you always end up here, eventually." I chuckled nervously. "What's that supposed to mean?" She didn't answer right away, just watched me closely as if sizing me up. This town, it has a way of pulling people in. It's not as quiet as it seems. I felt a shiver run down my spine, but shrugged it off. "I'm just passing through, really. I'm not here for long." "Of course." Her smile faded, but her eyes lingered on me, almost pitying. "Don't stay too long, Ellie. You might not like what you find." I didn't understand what she meant at the time, and I left the shop feeling unsettled but dismissive of the old woman's words. Small towns are full of quirky characters, and I told myself she was just one of them. But it wasn't long before I began to understand what she had meant. A few days later, I took a walk through the town's park, trying to clear my mind. The weather was perfect. Crisp autumn air and the golden light of the setting sun made everything seem peaceful. But as I walked past the old oak tree near the center of the park, I saw something strange. There, beneath the tree, was an old, weathered box, half buried in the dirt. Curious, I knelt down and dug it out, brushing away the dirt and leaves. It was a small wooden box, sealed tight with rusted metal clasps. There was no name, no markings, just the faint smell of decay. I was hesitant at first, but I couldn't resist. I opened the box. Inside, I found an assortment of odd objects: a tarnished pocket watch, a faded photograph, a collection of tiny, delicate bones, and what looked like a small vial of dark liquid. It all felt wrong, out of place. But there was one thing that caught my attention: a single black feather, perfectly preserved. I didn't know why, but the feather seemed to draw me in. I held it in my hand, feeling an odd, unexplainable sensation like it was vibrating in my palm. Suddenly, I heard a voice, low and insistent. "Put it back." I snapped my head around, heart racing. But there was no one in sight. I couldn't explain it, but I did what the voice said. I placed the feather back in the box, closed it, and buried it again. I thought that would be the end of it. I should have known better. That night, things began to happen. At first, it was small things. The lights flickered. I heard strange knocking sounds at the door, though no one was there when I opened it. But the next night, it escalated. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of footsteps walking across my floor. They were slow, deliberate, as if someone was trying to sneak around, but with heavy steps that shook the floorboards. I held my breath, trying to listen for any other sounds, but there was nothing. Just the heavy breathing of someone, or something, close by. I checked every room, convinced I was imagining things. But when I reached the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, standing at the end of the hall, was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette, its face obscured by shadows. It was just standing there, motionless, watching me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My heart hammered in my chest as the figure began to slowly move toward me. The air grew thick, suffocating, and then, just as it was within arm's reach, the lights flickered once more, and the figure was gone. I ran out of my house that night, panicked, unsure of what I was dealing with. I didn't know what was real anymore. I tried to convince myself that it was just stress, just a bad dream, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I went straight to the antique shop, determined to find answers. The old woman was behind the counter again, looking as though she'd been waiting for me. "I know what you did," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I froze. "What do you mean?" "You found the box," she said, nodding slowly. "And you took something from it, didn't you?" I didn't know how she knew, but she was right. I couldn't lie about it. "It's not just a box, Ellie," she continued. "It's a curse. That feather, it belongs to something ancient, something that's been here long before this town was built. The town has its own rules, its own ways of feeding. And when someone disturbs the past like you did, it's not just the town that's affected. It's you. The thing you awakened is coming for you now." I felt my stomach churn. "What is it?" The woman's eyes grew darker. "It's not a ghost, not a spirit. It's something far worse, something that preys on those who come looking for answers, and now that it knows you, it won't let you go." I tried to leave, to run, but as I stepped out of the shop, I felt the same heavy presence from the night before. I was being followed, watched. It wasn't just in my house, it was in the town itself. That night, I went home and locked every door, every window. But no matter how many times I checked, the footsteps came again. This time, they were louder, closer. The thing was in my house. I could feel it. Its dark energy suffocating everything around me. I don't know how long I can last. I'm not sure if anyone else can see it or if they're too afraid to acknowledge it. But one thing is certain. This town has a darkness that won't let you escape once it's marked you. And I'm a part of it. I just hope someone out there can hear me before it's too late. Get ready for more spooky stories. Don't forget to subscribe.
Next story.
I never believed in ghosts, at least not in the way that people in small towns believed. You know, those stories about haunted houses or restless spirits that wander through the night. But after what happened to me in that little town, I don't think I'll ever look at the world the same way again. It was a few years ago when I first arrived in that small town. It wasn't on any map. Not that I had checked. I was driving cross country, trying to leave behind a life I wasn't proud of. I figured a small town would be the perfect place to start over. No one knew me, and I could just blend in. I rented a tiny rundown cabin on the outskirts of town. It was a place where people came and went, but no one stayed long enough to make it anything more than a blip on the radar. I didn't mind. It had an old, creaky charm to it that I found oddly comforting. The town was quiet, almost unnervingly so, but I liked that too. I wasn't looking for excitement. The first few days were peaceful. I explored the town, met a few of the locals, and got used to the silence. But there was something about that silence that seemed too quiet. It wasn't peaceful, it was suffocating. I couldn't quite shake the feeling that something was wrong. One afternoon, as I was walking through town, I met an older man sitting on a bench by the general store. His name was George, and he seemed like he knew everything about the town. He was the kind of guy who'd been around long enough to see it all, or so he said. "Most folks don't stay here long," he told me, eyeing me with a knowing look. "Don't get too comfortable." I didn't think much of it at the time. It was just a weird thing for him to say, but I brushed it off. A week later, things started to get strange. It began with sounds, small, odd noises that seemed to come from nowhere. At first, I thought it was the house settling, or perhaps animals outside. But then at night, I started hearing footsteps. Soft, slow footsteps walking just outside my cabin. Sometimes they'd stop and I'd hold my breath, hoping they'd go away. But then they'd start again, circling the house, getting closer and closer to my window. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Then one night, as I was sitting in the living room, trying to read, I saw something outside. It was a figure, just standing in the yard, watching my window. I froze. The figure was tall, shrouded in shadow, its face obscured. I couldn't tell if it was a person or something else entirely, but there it stood, motionless. I didn't know what to do. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I forced myself to move. I grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, determined to confront whatever it was. But when I stepped into the yard, the figure was gone. I searched the property, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no sign of anyone. I felt foolish, but that uneasy feeling didn't go away. Something was out there, and it was waiting for me to make the wrong move. The next day, I went to the general store, hoping to shake off the feeling of dread. George was sitting on the same bench, looking like he'd been there for hours. "You seen it, haven't you?" he asked, his voice low. "Seen what?" I asked, but deep down, I knew. "The thing that walks the night," he said, nodding slowly. "It's been around for years. Always comes for people who think they can escape." I tried to laugh it off, but George's eyes were serious. There was a weight in his words, a knowing that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I had to know more. "Why does it come for people?" I asked. George didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared off into the distance, as if debating whether or not to tell me. Finally, he spoke in a hushed voice. "Years ago, a family lived on the property you're staying on. They were different. The town tried to help them, tried to get them to leave, but they wouldn't. They said they were chosen. They said the land had called them, and then, one by one, they disappeared." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Disappeared? What do you mean?" "They were never found. The house was abandoned, but the thing that had taken them, it didn't leave. It's been waiting ever since." I didn't know what to think. I was tempted to dismiss George's words as the ramblings of an old man, but something in the way he said it made me think he wasn't lying. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing those footsteps again, circling the house, getting closer. I pulled the covers over my head and prayed it would stop. The next morning, I packed my things and decided I was done with that town. I didn't care what had happened there before or what George had said. I wasn't staying one more night. As I loaded my car, I noticed something strange. There was a small figure standing at the edge of the woods, watching me. It was far off, but I could see it clearly. It was the same figure I had seen the other night. This time, I didn't hesitate. I drove away, not looking back. For days, I didn't think about the town. I tried to put it out of my mind, but the feeling of being watched never really left. And every time I passed through another small town, I would hear stories about strange things that happened to people who had lived there. They always said the same thing: once you're in, you can't leave. I don't know what that thing was, or what happened to those people. But I do know this. If you ever find yourself driving through a quiet town, and someone warns you not to stay, maybe you should listen, because some towns they don't let you leave. Want more spine-chilling stories? Hit the subscribe button now.
Next story.
I didn't expect to end up in Milford. I was just passing through on my way to a conference in a nearby city. But when my car broke down in the middle of nowhere, the small, sleepy town was the only place I could find to stay for the night. The locals were friendly enough, at least on the surface. The diner was warm and inviting, with the smell of fresh coffee and fried bacon in the air. The owner, a man in his mid-60s named Harold, didn't ask too many questions when I walked in and took a seat at the counter. "Stranger in town?" he asked, wiping his hands on a towel. "Car broke down," I replied, trying to keep it simple. "Just need a place to stay for the night." Harold chuckled and nodded. "Well, you're in luck. We don't get many visitors, but we've got a good inn here. Just down the road, you'll find it. Just don't go wandering past the woods after dark, all right?" I gave him a puzzled look, but he just waved it off with a casual smile. "Folks around here get a little weird at night is all," he said with a chuckle. The warning didn't seem too serious, so I brushed it off. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories or strange local superstitions, but as I made my way to the inn, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. The inn was a charming, old building with creaky wooden floors and vintage furnishings. I checked in, and the woman at the desk, a tired-looking woman named Agnes, handed me a key without saying much more than a polite, "Good night." The room was cozy, if a bit dusty, and as night fell, I tried to relax, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. It wasn't the room itself, but something in the air, something thick and suffocating. Around midnight, I was woken by a noise, a soft tapping at my window. Startled, I sat up in bed and glanced toward the source of the sound. It was coming from the trees outside. I crept toward the window, half expecting to see an animal or a bird, but when I looked out, I saw nothing but darkness and the occasional movement of branches in the wind. But the tapping didn't stop. It continued, rhythmic and steady. My heart began to pound. I thought about calling the front desk, but something held me back. I couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the isolation, or maybe it was just my imagination running wild. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my coat and stepped outside, making my way to the trees. The night was cold, and the air felt damp against my skin. The tapping continued, louder now, as if it was calling me closer. I followed the sound into the woods, despite the chill that ran down my spine. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked deeper into the forest. The further I went, the darker it got. It wasn't like normal darkness, though. It was thick, like something had soaked into the air itself. The tapping was louder now, almost frantic, and I was sure it was coming from just ahead. I reached a small clearing, and what I saw there made my blood run cold. A group of figures stood in the center, hunched over, their faces hidden in the shadows. They weren't moving, but the tapping sound was coming from them. The figures had their hands raised toward the sky, tapping their fingers on the trees around them in a rhythmic, almost hypnotic pattern. I stood frozen, my breath caught in my throat. The figures seemed to sense my presence, and slowly they turned toward me. Their faces were pale, almost translucent, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was paralyzed by fear. One of the figures took a step toward me. The sound of its footsteps was unnatural, like the rustling of dry leaves in a storm. It reached out, and I felt a chill creep over me, as if the very air itself was turning colder. "Leave," a voice rasped, barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure's gaze was locked on mine, and it felt like its eyes were digging into my soul. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the figure withdrew into the shadows. The others followed, disappearing into the trees with an eerie silence. My body finally allowed me to move. I stumbled backward, my heart racing, and ran back to the inn. When I reached the front door, I slammed it shut behind me and locked it. I took a moment to catch my breath, my mind racing to make sense of what I had just seen. The next morning, I checked out of the inn before the sun even fully rose. I didn't care about the car or about fixing it. I just needed to get out of Milford. As I drove away, I glanced back toward the woods one last time, but all I could see was the thick line of trees stretching toward the horizon, peaceful and still. I didn't tell anyone about what had happened. I don't think anyone would believe me anyway. But every now and then when I'm alone, I hear it. The tapping. Soft, rhythmic, like a faraway echo. I'm just grateful I never went back to see what it was truly trying to tell me.